There is a small part of me that wishes, maybe, just maybe, Vladimir Zelensky might find time next week, let's say 15 minutes, to mark Passover. Not a full-fledged, for questions, for children, for cups kind of ceremony, and certainly not with family who must surely be in a safer place, but a Rabban Gamliel kind of Seder. Gamliel is a sage who taught that unless we acknowledge the three symbols of Passover, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, we haven't properly celebrated the festival. Isn't it amazing how three symbols can warrant an entire evening of discussion? The Haggadah is as old as our liberation from Egypt and as new as the concerns of people who are living in this world. We use it to connect to a history which binds generations past and future together, and to shape our children, the next generation, and above all, to sensitize ourselves to the moment in which we find ourselves. Several weeks ago, I spoke with members of the European Liberal Rabbis Network to learn of their needs as they continue to support refugees during this crisis. And one additional outcome of a brief conversation was what new symbols might find their way to the Seder plate. Just as putting grapes on the Seder plate was a way to bring attention to the conditions of farm workers in the 60s, and how a blood-red beet is often substituted for the shank bone in a vegetarian Seder, and how Purell and masks had a featured place on the Seder plate during the last 2 years of isolation. This year, we need to make room for both brokenness and the hope for peace. Our European colleagues suggest olives, of course, along with grapes and figs, to evoke the verse, "Everyone should sit under their vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid." And they also recommend that sunflower seeds, the symbol of Ukrainian resistance, should have a prominent place. At the Seder's conclusion, with its promise of peace and renewal, they suggest planting those seeds as a harbinger of hope. I share their words tonight because it is Shabbat HaGadol, the great Sabbath, when we recount the particulars of Passover to prepare ourselves physically and spiritually for the holiday and for the original story of redemption. Each year, we have no choice but to begin where we are. In this world of global connections, an unjust, unnecessary war has become our starting point. As the Jewish president of a besieged nation, will President Zelensky be able to mark the moment as we do? In the midst of war, what would it mean for him to taste the message of freedom through Jewish ritual? And will he feel the solidarity of the entire Jewish world behind him, as so many Jews frame the Seder's message of redemption through the lens of Ukraine's struggle? The Haggadah instructs that the Seder story, which begins in degradation, must conclude in praise, meaning that over the course of a single evening, we have the potential to be carried along and transformed by its message. Each year, our ancestors' journey concludes with safety, found on the other side of the sea, a crossing which for many has yet to be traversed. That is the story we tell and retell, but right now the reality cannot keep pace. 10 million refugees so far racing to safety, to border crossings, trains carrying women and children to an uncertain future with literally nothing more than the clothes on their back, leaving behind fathers and grandfathers, brothers and sons and uncles, not even matzah in hand. In April 1939, Rabbi Julian B. Feibelman of Temple Sinai in New Orleans spoke these words from his pulpit. Suppose you were at this moment a refugee from political oppression in Europe. Suppose you were wandering between the well-guarded boundaries of any country in that no man's land of frontier division where you could neither turn back nor go forward. Suppose you had been required to leave your possessions, your resources, everything save the bare necessities of life behind, and venture forth, a despised pariah, without hope, without haven, without friend, without home. Suppose the future held no glimmer of hope for you. This is the situation in which thousands and thousands find themselves at this moment. From security, they have been reduced to insecurity, and from self-sustaining livelihoods to dependence. Humanity is on trial. That was 1939. This week, as we learned of the horrors perpetuated in Bucha, humanity is on trial again, with scenes of war crimes, abuse, and torture, which we never thought we would see again in our lifetime. Matt Miller, advisor to the National Security Council, noted simply, "Whatever you call it, it's apparent, it's an atrocity." How close it is to Babi Yar, the mass grave of Jewish victims of Nazi and, yes, Ukrainian brutality during World War II. The physical proximity is one thing, but the emotional and historical proximity is another. The lesson of World War II applies today as well. Brutal dictators cannot stand. The sermon Rabbi Leo M. Franklin of Temple Bethel of Detroit preached in 1933 could have been given today simply swapping one evil autocrat for another. He said, as one looks over the face of modern events, he cannot fail to realize that Germany today is the menace to world peace, and that until the power of Hitler is curbed and some semblance of sanity is restored in the Reich, any sense of security that the nations may feel will be at best an illusion. And we don't have to reach at all to make the necessary comparisons to Putin's menacing power and how failure to constrain him affects the stability of the entire world. Like Pharaoh with his defective, hardened heart, like Hitler who had no heart, Putin is shaping his own legacy in the image of Stalin. In a remarkable compendium entitled Agony in the Pulpit, Jewish Preaching in Response to Nazi Persecution and Mass Murder, Mark Saperstein shows that, contrary to popular opinion, American Jewish leaders were not silent about what was happening in Europe. Rabbis spoke about it constantly from the pulpit and on the radio. It made a difference, bringing both awareness and comfort to their communities. Their words roused their congregations to do what they could to condemn the war and to support its victims as well, whether it was through donations or demonstrations to influence public policy. Today, as people and nations respond to the urging of President Zelensky to stand up to evil, we come closer to justice with every response. We can lift up our voices too during the Seder, for that is an historic way to situate and make sense of the circumstances in which we find ourselves. Guided by text and custom, we explain the meaning of each step as we move from rubric to rubric. And we are reminded that tradition teaches that those who add to the ceremony, who enhance it with additional explanations or dwell on its significance, those are worthy of praise. And here are some contemporary insights crafted by those same European liberal rabbis, whose first lesson begins with the opening of the Seder with Kadesh, which reminds us that all of God's creation is holy. Orchatz, washing hands, they say is a reminder not to wash our hands in the suffering of others. And they say that the salt water this year represents the tears of displaced people. Maror, the horseradish, is the bitter taste of losing one's home, one's family, one's country. The shank bone is a visual symbol for all, crying out to remember, never to forget all those who have died, whether fighting for freedom or as victims of bombing. And in addition, these rabbis urge us to break not only the middle matzah, which will become the afikomen, the taste of freedom at the end of the meal, but to break something that symbolizes the unity of the Jewish people. Break that in half, they instruct, and then, at the very end of the Seder, put it back together, just as our Jewish community is always reunited around shared ideals. And what about the egg, I asked? The egg is always the same. It is the symbol of hope, they said. We must continue to hope. When we look to the future with hope, whether it is through the prophet Elijah or Miriam, we liberate ourselves from some of the oppressive immediate horror before us, just as we take comfort in God's redemption of our ancestors. And so we are obliged to tell today's story of struggle and freedom and redemption to our children through these ancient symbols. On Passover in 1940, Rabbi Nathan Perelman delivered a sermon on freedom from this pulpit. He said, "It is a strange thing for a people to remind itself, as we do, of its enslavement in the past. Other people remind themselves of past victories only. I like to think it is a proud claim which Israel makes. We were slaves in Egypt, but we have never been enslaved since. We have been hostages, we have been refugees. We have been victims of every oppression. We have been reduced to second-class citizenship, persecuted, discriminated against and driven out. But we were slaves only once. From that slavery we were freed, not by a political philosopher's realized dream, nor by a revolutionist's successful conflict, nor by a poet's emotional flight. We were freed by God and shall never know enslavement as long as our faith abides. May our faith endure as we act as God's partners in seeking freedom and peace. Shabbat Shalom, Azizen Pesach.